Welcome to the Nerd Journey Podcast. Our goal is to help you, the technology professional, accelerate your career progression, increase your job satisfaction, and be more effective in your existing role.
We want to bring listeners like you the career advice we wish we'd been given earlier in our careers.
I'm John White, at VJourneyman on Twitter, sharing co-host duties with Nick Cordy, at NetworkNerd_.
We're two former IT operations guys who have moved on to pre-sales roles with technology vendors. We have our opinions, but we also like to highlight the journeys of others and see what we can learn from them.
We'd also like to ask for your feedback to make this a conversation, not a one-way broadcast. Email us at nerdjourneypodcast@gmail.com or DM us at nerdjourney on Twitter. So come join us on our nerd journey.
Let's take a trip. Episode 284. Does your work speak for itself, or should you be speaking for your work? And if asked, could you tell the story of your career, that personal narrative that describes your experience? Jason Belk is a senior technical advocate at Cisco, and someone who has a very hot take on the answer to those questions. But before we answer those questions by sharing part 2 of Jason's story, let's recap part 1 of the story in episode 283. We met a young Jason Belk who studied computer science and took a job as a video game tester, and later worked in IT student services at his university, eventually making his way to an internship at Cisco. We followed Jason's progress through his experience as an IT analyst at Cisco and his pivot to network engineering. Jason shared his thoughts on technical certifications and how we might decide in the event that we're not sure what technical certification to pick. And he also talked about the responsibility of the technologist to get more people into our industry. This week in part 2, you'll hear about why we should each be building a portfolio of work and how Jason went about doing it. You'll hear some reasons for leaving a company and then returning to that same company later on. And we'll see how that works into Jason's story and how he grew as a result of those transitions. And what are some tactics we can use to notice whether we're stressed? I think you'll find some very interesting tips given in this discussion that maybe we haven't covered on the show before. Let's get you to part 2 of our discussion with Jason Belk. Talking with other people who are trying to break into a specific industry or type of job. I have the interest, I've done this training, I've tinkered a little bit, but I don't have the experience in this scale of environment, or I just don't have any experience in a production environment, and that is the problem I'm having with getting hired. Any guidance on that one?
I think just like artists have a portfolio of their work online, you as a technical person, if you want to be directing your own career, should have a portfolio of your work. And that looks different for different roles. For me, I'm more of in a teaching capacity. That looked like having a course that I built and I put on my GitHub. I use Markdown to write it. And that actually got me one of my jobs that got me out of Cisco. I think especially in this day and age where we have containers, you have infrastructure as code, you have AWS, you have these ways of provisioning and maintaining very powerful virtual computers and databases that historically speaking would have required rooms full of cables and coordination to set up and play around with. Nowadays, at the click of a button, for very low cost or sometimes free resources to play around with these environments. So I know Cisco, we have built-in labs for our different courses. I know Cisco DevNet also has what we call the reservable sandboxes. So if you want to use network infrastructure, automation, scenarios, that it gives you a VPN, you can log in, you can play around with it, and they have different scenarios. So that maybe like take one of those scenarios for one of these demo environments and extend it yourself. Like, okay, so this one's telling me to set up a new VPN tunnel. What if I set up one with a different IP address? Or what if I set up 3 of them? Or what if I created a Python script to do the same thing? Or finding ways of taking the existing task that you're familiar with and then expanding on that and then documenting that into your portfolio. And especially in your portfolio, I'd say having ways for other people to reproduce those steps. So you could point to them like, here's the Docker container on how I use or here's the virtual machine that I use for my setup. So you could do it yourself and see how my code worked or how my scenario worked. that's a huge part for me is finding ways of taking these concepts and then continuing to incrementally extend them in ways that other people can reproduce. And I think at production scale, like production is going to look different depending on what type of environment you're going into. The production environment that I worked at in Cisco IT when I was in the network operations team, we had 10,000 devices, 10,000 network devices. That includes like access points and other things. And then that's not counting all the devices of people connected to those routers and switches.
Yeah, that would be way more.
We had 600 sites. It would require me to be an expert level person to reproduce that production environment on my own. But realistically, in a Cisco environment, I'm not the only person supporting that network too. Am I trying to recreate a scenario that's realistically never going to happen? Versus it's like, well, at what size of network would I be the only person working on it? I don't know. Maybe like 50 devices, 100 devices, whatever that number is. You can always look at different websites too if you've never done this before. Oftentimes, they'll give you the scale of the network they're working on. So you can just look at job requirements. You can just go to job postings, just go through them and see what are the skills they need. Oh, you'll be managing 50 to 100 devices and you'll need to know these routing protocols and these switching protocols and these security concepts. So like just seeing what are people expecting right now and how many of those things do I know? And if you're seeing trends among those, start building scenarios that allow you to do that at scale for yourself and a scale that makes sense. You don't need to have 10,000 devices, but you probably want more than 5.
I like that. And maybe if the scale of the environment is not indicated in the job description, that's a good interview question that we can use to sniff test, are we really out over our skis in this interview or not? On that same point, if I was in a job interview and let's say it wasn't listed on the job description that this is a 1,000 device network, holistically speaking, and I've done, maybe 100 or so in my lab, how can I communicate that in an honest way and still hope to get the job?
I think it's one of those things where if they ask you specifically about it, you want to be honest, but I wouldn't volunteer weakness preemptively unless this is like your first job and you have other concerns. I think it's one of those things where you will probably be fine and figure it out as you go. And then there's other people on the team who can kind of coach you on those scaling issues, because there are definitely scaling issues. Like when we were building automation for Cisco's network, we ran into issues. It wasn't necessarily the sheer number of devices. It was also the nature of the connections, where we were trying to automate software upgrades to network devices all over the world. The ones that were specifically edge cases were in developing countries that had intermittent connectivity issues and lower bandwidth and throughput. We were trying to push these software images that are like 800 megabytes. And when you're on a 10 megabyte connection that flaps, another thing to learn is like when you're transferring a file on a Cisco device, at least the ones we were working with, if it was interrupted, it started over. That's just the nature of how the software was built. And it was funny because I would talk to other product managers. Like I was in IT at the time, I was talking to other people who were like trying to build products to do this type of thing their own. And they weren't taking into account these situations because they were just working in the lab in this ideal environment. They're like, oh yeah, you just push the image, it's so easy. And I'm like, well, what about this? What about the different types of boot statements depending on the hardware platforms? If it's, dual supervisor versus single supervisor, like, oh, we hadn't thought about that. I think there are certain things that you will just learn once you're on the job, but you need to be aware and keen to like looking out for those problems. And fortunately, I was working with an engineer who had previously worked in TAC, Cisco's technical support center. And so he knew all those things to look for. And that made our software so much more resilient, having somebody on our team that had been troubleshooting for years in all kinds of situations and knew what to look for, everything. So when it came to like developing these solutions, we could have a better understanding of what scale. And oftentimes also, I'd say there's not an indefinite number of problems that could arise. That's like the 80-20 rule. There's certain things you're going to run into, and in your career, you'll probably run into those fairly quickly, or have people give you a heads up about that, or they might be in scenarios in your certifications for troubleshooting. I know a lot of certifications also have hands-on troubleshooting scenarios. So pay attention to those things. Like they don't put them on certifications or courses for fun. I mean, they should be there helping teach you what are the different issues that will come up in an actual production environment.
You don't want to be focused on things that maybe aren't as likely to happen in a real live environment, and it's a theoretical possibility. Here's what I'd like to know, Jason, as we continue our discussion here. At what point in your journey did you start building that public profile, that public body of work? Because we talked about how important that was and how much it can help someone get their next job. I want to know when you started building it, and if you knew that was what you needed to do, or someone coached you on that?
For me, it was after I had been at Cisco for about 5 years. And so I had my internship. I'd been there for 5 years. I was an analyst for 3 years. And then I was, at that time, like a network engineer for about 2 years. It was when I was like, okay, I've been at Cisco for a while. I want to be open to other opportunities. And I think I don't have a specific memory of someone telling me to do that specific. It probably happened because I had a lot of good mentors in my life at that time. But I think the way in which I did it is definitely not something I've back then see a lot of people do. I think it's still not as common as it should be, especially on the technical side. I think there's just a lot of people who are in the technology space in a technical role feel like their work should speak for itself. I definitely run into a lot of people who are like, oh, I don't want to tell my manager I did this. Like, my work will speak for itself. I'm like, no, like they're busy and they're going to forget. And that person I talked to like hadn't gotten a promotion in like 7 years. They'd just been doing the same thing in and out. And like the business is happy with that. Like they don't give you more money and like you're still doing a great job. I think if you want to both, one, protect yourself from layoffs, and two, continue to make more money as you're adding more value, if you're a constant learner, listening to a podcast like this, listening to someone like us talk about career development, you're already in a fraction of the percent that is caring about their job more than most people. If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably somebody who should be building some type of public profile. It doesn't have to be a GitHub profile like I was talking about. There's plenty of websites out there, WordPress, down the list, a lot of different ones where you can just blog. You can say, this is what I've learned from project management. This is what I've learned from leadership. This is what I've learned from conflict resolution. There's so many different directions, even apart from the technical side, that you can be sharing your learnings. And then that gives you an artifact then you can share with other people, regardless of their background. And also it gives you confidence that you can see over time how you've grown. And I think, at least in corporate life, we do have, evaluations where we're talking about what we did for that year. And I know you've talked about in the podcast before that you do your own note-taking skills. And so that could be like a form of that note-taking where that way you don't have to rush to update your resume if you want to find a new job. You're just like continually incrementing it. And then when the opportunity comes up, yeah, you might need to like spend 30 minutes to like wordsmiths, whatever their form looks like for a cover letter or something. But the meaty stuff, the technical stuff, the stuff that's going to actually get you the job and get people excited to talk to you, it's going to be better while you're freshly working on it. Like if I try to retroactively go back and redo all the work that I've done over the past 10 years on that profile, it'd be a Herculean effort and probably would never happen. But if I spend an afternoon here, an afternoon there, even some weekends and nights, we're talking about not burning yourself out, but sometimes you need to put in the time. You also have to do your day job. I just encourage anybody who is looking to grow their career listening to this podcast, take the time to find a way to document your learnings. It doesn't have to be eloquent. It doesn't have to be perfect. And you can always go back and edit it. Like nothing's set in stone.
That's a great point. Especially if you put it on LinkedIn, you can change it. You can add to it. You can say it differently. There's no rule that says it's a one and done exercise. Now, it is a one and done exercise when you submit your resume for a job, right? That's the only version that person's going to see. But yeah, you are so right. You need to get your first draft out there, documented down on paper, just like we talked about before, that synthesis of writing and rewriting. And you may want to communicate this differently as a bullet point on your resume or on LinkedIn because you're after a particular type of position.
I think especially for something like LinkedIn, it's okay to not post off the cuff whatever you're thinking.
Oh, yeah.
I feel like LinkedIn especially has kind of turned into a place where it's more longer form content that has a longer shelf life. I'm pretty active on both Twitter, X, and LinkedIn. Oftentimes, I'll use Twitter to post my initial thought. And then if it gets a lot of reactions, then I'll spend a little more time to build the LinkedIn draft. And even before I do a tweet, I'll use my Apple Notes on my phone. I've been using that so much more recently, and that's helped me so much where previously I would have these moments of inspiration when I'm walking the dog or in the shower, doing different activities, and I wouldn't have time to flesh it out. But just throwing in Apple Notes, the search feature is good enough that I'm usually able to find it without too much effort, or I can pin them and put them in folders and stuff. There's another podcast I really enjoy called the Software Defined Talk, where they talk about using the defaults lifestyle, like trying to pick things that most of the time, the benefit of having that integrated ecosystem is going to outweigh the cost of like the minor features you get from something else. I know people have different opinions when it comes to technology religions, but I found that to be useful too, where it's like, I have an iPhone, I have a MacBook Pro for work, we have an Apple TV, and like it makes me seamless to be able to like have a note on my phone. If I want to share something with my wife on the TV screen, I can just share it from my iPhone on the Apple TV. So that's a whole nother direction, but I just want to throw out there specifically using a note-taking software on your mobile device. And sometimes I'll even use voice to text, getting it from my mind onto paper and removing the barrier to entry of even typing in all the words with my fingers, and just going voice to text helps a lot too.
Yeah. And what you're talking about is maybe not tossing it out there if it's not something you haven't thought about. It's make it a complete thought. And when you do this and you refine things and you go back and look at what you've produced and what you've accomplished, that might give you enough momentum and confidence, as you said, to take on that next challenge, whatever it is. Maybe it's a passion project or a project at work that you hadn't been thinking about going for. And we need to see those things to help us remember that the things we've done meant something. They were accomplishments, and we learned through that process, or hopefully we learned through that process, right?
One of the reasons I'm able to come on this podcast and have these great conversations about my career is that this isn't the first time I've had this conversation. I mean, this conversation is unique and we're going in a great direction, lots of good questions, but I've talked about my career so many times over the years, and I have my own internal narrative where there's so many details of people that have influenced me in my career that I definitely value them, but just based on the nature of how I've rehearsed in my head, okay, when I was in Cisco IT, I did this. When I was in Network to Code, I did this. When I was in IT Student Service, I did this. And there are just certain details I always skip. You kind of fit into a groove after you start explaining things a number of times where it makes it easier for you then to communicate your value. Like you might lose some details, but on the other hand, the more that you articulate your value, what you've brought to the company, what you've done in your different roles, it makes it even more comfortable for you then. You have this narrative in your head that one will help you in those job interview situations, your management conversations when you're talking promotions, and even just for your own mental health and knowing that what you're doing is making a difference in whatever area of the world that you're working in.
And those are the presentations that we don't oftentimes prepare for, right? The presentation we have to make in that interview or in the performance review, we don't prep for them as much as if I told someone, hey, you have to go give this conference talk. Would you put in the same kind of effort in preparation in both of those scenarios? I would hope so, but maybe we don't think about that enough.
Exactly. I'd say that the first time I did that formally on a podcast, I definitely put a lot of effort in. Like I had a Microsoft Word file open, I had my LinkedIn, my resume together, and I had tons of paragraphs of things that I'd written out. So going back to that process where I found a way to write into words what that narrative was, and then that's the narrative that I've been continuing to talk when I go on and I share with other people the different things I've worked on.
And when someone finds your narrative or evidence of your narrative somewhere and brings you an opportunity, sometimes it's a really good chance to do something completely different. Let's talk about your decision to go and work for Network to Code. I know there were some things that kind of led to that decision.
Yeah.
And it has to do with the earlier parts of the story. So can you share that with us?
So I was in Cisco IT as an analyst. I moved into the networking position. I was in the campus and branch team and moved more into automation, like we had talked about before, doing Python. And I was learning so much. And I found my skill was more helping other network engineers learn to code Python, Ansible, using YAML, all that kind of fun stuff. I find the most interesting jobs, the most interesting things I get to do in my work are the ones that I self-direct and suggest to my managers. So I'd say if you ever feel like you're struggling to find interesting work, you should be more proactive in suggesting things that you can be doing. And so that was an example of one of my managers like, hey, we want somebody to be doing automation. And I took that as like, okay, so this is a management priority. I have a computer science undergrad. I'm interested in getting more into automation. It seems like kind of a big deal and a fun thing to do. And my own personality, I like to make things more efficient. And so I was finding my value was getting more and more on like the Scrum Master, project manager, leader, mentor, teacher side of things, more so than the frontline engineer who's solving the problems. I had been following Network to Code for a few years at that point because they are one of the initial and main thought leaders when it comes to network automation, especially from a vendor neutral perspective. I knew them from their contributions to the open source community where they had built a lot of different Ansible, Python, as well as what they call text FSM, which allows you to take raw network data and turn it into a structured format. Then you're able to more precisely navigate and understand what's going on. I was involved in their Slack community and I was like, man, the people who are at this company just really are there to help people and do the right thing and solving technology problems, not just for their customers, but for the industry overall. And I knew they did training consulting, but like they didn't have like a job listings page or anything, but I was following them on Twitter. And the founder, Jason Edelman, I'd read his book too. He had written a book on network automation. I messaged him. I was like, hey, I read your book. I saw you tweeted about you're looking to hire people, but like this is my background and interested in doing training. So I sent him a link to my GitHub profile, which had a link to my Markdown-based NSO course. So I built a course based on the automation technology that we had learned. Within a few days, I was already interviewing. Like I had 3 interviews in a week, and like I left Cisco within like 2 or 3 weeks. It all happened very quickly, but I'd been Cisco for 7 years. I was already kind of ready for something new. I was like, I want to see if the grass is greener outside of the corporate Cisco bubble that I'd always been in. And also, I felt like I hit the upper limit of what I could do in my current position, where management was starting to focus on other projects that weren't the area that I was building expertise in. And so like, okay, well, it looks like priorities are shifting. My coworker left the company. I knew they were going to dump all his work on me. So like, this is a good time to take this opportunity. But it was a big leap of faith because this was the first job I had ever taken where I didn't know anybody in the company. I knew the vibes of the company from being involved in their online Slack community. But when I had joined the networking team, I had a friend. When I joined Cisco as an analyst, I had my other friend, James, who had worked there before. And all these different connections, every other job, I basically had known someone. So that was definitely a blind leap of faith. And I really enjoyed my time there. Like it was totally different because I went from being at a 60,000 person company to being 11 people, and also going to the office every day in San Jose headquarters. You know, they have 60 buildings. They were based in New York City, and they didn't have anybody on the West Coast. So I was the first person on the West Coast working full-time remote and was traveling often. So I would go to different customer sites, build course curriculum, deliver the courses. So that's when I really grew my presentation skills because it's kind of sink or swim. I did some sinking. I did a lot of swimming. I think joining Network to Code was, at least for me, a huge risk just because I was like, I'm leaving everything I know and all the people I know, big company culture I know, to this startup-ish mentality. And I learned so much, and I love the relationship with the people, and I still keep in touch with them. But after doing that for about a little over 2 years, I was starting to get a little burnt out. We were having trouble in our marriage. I was gaining weight, and like I was just working so much because similar to Electronic Arts to a lesser extent, like there was such a strong culture of excellence. And as a consulting company, you're on the customer's dime where it's like, we have billable hours, we have the deliverables we've committed to, and we need to get them done. And so I wanted to be a part of that solution. And I think just having those expectations for me made it difficult for me to have the work-life balance. And so I saw a job opportunity come up back at Cisco, and that we were also looking to have kids. And so going back to the big company was a big component of that.
Let me just rewind a tad. I don't think you mentioned previously in our discussion what motivated you to build that course that you put out on GitHub in the first place. Can you speak to that real quick?
When we built it, we built it internally for our own use initially. We basically used Markdown because one of the other guys I was working with was much more well-versed in Markdown and GitHub and GitLab and pull requests and all that kind of fun stuff. And so he was the one spearheading that for our team. And so I learned it along with him. And we documented it just for our own local team in San Jose. And then we talked to our manager, like, oh, we want to train up the other engineers in the other locations within Cisco IT. We were going to deliver this training that we created. We're going to give a 3-day training to our coworkers in London and a 3-day training to our coworkers in Bangalore, India. They gave us, I can't remember, 3-6 months to build the training. We built the training. We got some lab infrastructure set up for network devices and servers, tested all the instructions, built our slides, and deliver that training twice. So myself, my other 2 coworkers, we each kind of traded off presenting these slides and demonstrations, and it went really well. Like the people really enjoyed the course because like we were fellow network operations engineers using scenarios that were relevant to them. We're like, these are the ones from the tickets that we've been working with, that we're all on the same team. We understand what the problems are. And so that's another big part, is like finding ways of building more relevance in what you're teaching based on, especially if you're teaching your own team. We built that training all in Markdown, had the slides. And then after it was all done, I asked our manager, like, hey, can we publish this online? They kind of thought about it. They're like, yeah, it's probably fine. But I basically put it on my GitHub because the other 2 coworkers had moved on to other projects. They weren't as interested in teaching as I was, even though all 3 of us developed it and we all kind of split it up. So I didn't want to take credit for it. But on the other hand, they had moved on to other things they weren't interested in. So I was like, okay, I'll just put it on my profile. And like over the years, it continued to gain a lot of momentum and even got to the point where they were using it to influence like the actual courses that Cisco was making for NSO.
Oh, wow.
And I had people reaching out to me for years for that one. We actually ended up having to update some of the slides. People were like, hey, like your slides are outdated. I'm like, yeah, it's just like a free thing I did a couple of years ago. Yeah, the product changes and stuff like that.
That's super cool.
We had supportive management who was willing to pay for our travel, willing to give us the time to teach our coworkers. And we took on the challenge of traveling internationally. Going both to London and Bangalore was awesome to see my coworkers in person, and especially India. I've never been before or since, and just being able to experience, eat the food. As a person based in the US, it's hard to build those connections with people in time zones that are really far away, where as soon as I'm getting online, they're getting on offline. So it's not even just the time amount overlap is minimal, but also the time of day makes it hard to be chipper. It's 8 p.m. for them when it's 8 a.m. for me. And so like nobody's like super thrilled to like be in a meeting at 8 p.m. On the flip side, just like I'm sure they probably felt the same thing. When I had 8 a.m. meetings, I have no caffeine. I'm probably just sitting there staring at the wall too.
I love the fact that you got that opportunity to go and meet and be with your coworkers, and you were doing one of the most interesting parts of your work, as you said, which was giving these presentations to other people. So I can certainly see how the network to code role was a nice logical shift into for you.
It was just for where I was at in my place in life. It worked out really well that I was able to devote that time and grow so much under their leadership and mentorship and relationships. But it just wasn't sustainable for me and how I operate my life, how much time I devote to work and how much stress I want to have at work. And I think part of that too is just the nature of a growing business where they went from 11 people to like over 50 or 60 in the 2 years I was there. And now there are several hundred. I knew it was a growth company. And I think it's just one of those things where I didn't know all the implications of how that would affect things. But I probably would have stayed there for another couple of years if I hadn't had like a perfect opportunity to show up in my lap. Leaving Cisco, like it was a really good comparison because I'd been at Cisco and like this big corporate behemoth, been around forever, and going to a smaller company that you could have a lot more autonomy just to have an idea and run with it, or take responsibility for things that otherwise you wouldn't have been asked to do because the silos are so rigid in larger companies.
When we talk about having too much stress in our lives or possibly on the brink of burnout, I know many of us have trouble noticing that that's happening because we're in the situation. Sometimes someone else has to point it out. Can you speak to how you came to the conclusion that you were overstressed in the role you were in and that something needed to give?
For me, I'd say one is just the physical side. I was gaining a lot of weight. And that wasn't just a network to code, that was also in the operations team. So like in the time I went from being an analyst to when I came back to Cisco in that 7 years, I probably gained like 40 pounds. If you look at your health, if like you're not making healthy choices and like you used to, or you're finding comfort in alcohol and food and other things that are not going to like actually fuel your body, is the environment you're in forcing you to find comfort in other food or substances that are trying to take away the stress of your situation? For me, it's really stressful to be on call, to jump in and be the savior of the situation. Some people love that, and that wasn't for me. Your physical health is a very clear metric. I'd say if you have a significant other, spouse, good close friend that you see on a regular basis, you can always ask them one-on-one, just what do you see in my life? I'm giving you a blank check to, if I trust you, to tell me, do you think I'm doing okay based on everything I talk about? Another aspect I'd say is look at your text conversations with your family, friends. Are you treating people in a way that is respectful and calm and collected? Or are you always jumping from one thing to the next, putting out fires? We all have situations where we have crunch time, but day after day, week after week, month after month, is the house always burning?
And are you always talking about it burning?
And is it always top of mind for you? Because you could be in a job situation where you're the fixer, and then you close your laptop and you go to play with your kids, and it's not bothering you at all. But like, is it in the back of your mind always when someone asks you how you're doing, or are you saying, oh man, work is so tough. Next week, work is so tough. If it's always tough, then it's more of a systemic issue that you need to be talking with your manager about, thinking about your career and things like that.
If it's always that tough, does that mean you want it to be that tough? Does that mean you feel powerless to change that or aren't sure what to do? You just need someone to acknowledge it. I think that in times of stress, we might forget to ask it, but the looking at the text messages, yes, that is fantastic. And as you said before, what are you posting on social media? What's the sentiment and attitude of those posts if you're someone who uses that heavily?
Oh, for sure. And I can even see that in how other people post. One of the beliefs I have from my own personal studies is that like your words are a reflection of your inner thoughts. It's an outflow of whatever your heart's filled with. So if you're soaking your mind in agitated political narrative, it's going to come up in your social media posts. If you're soaking your mind in the stress of your job, people have different temperaments, but are you always on the edge of a problem? Are you always under attack? It's like maybe there's these other influences that are pushing you in this situation.
Well, I know that an influence to get into a different situation is an unexpected job opportunity. And you mentioned the opportunity to come back to Cisco, which, as we can tell from this recording, must have worked out well. I know that we've talked to people who've returned to companies that they worked at before, and I'm always curious about the return and what you hoped might be different this time, and maybe some of the boundaries you put in place this go around that you didn't think to before. Can you speak to that?
I think for me, there was a certain level of comfort in knowing that I was going into a company culture that I knew very well was positive overall. I mean, there's layoffs almost every year at Cisco. That's not great. Apart from that, like the narrative that the leaders of Cisco have given, from John Chambers when I first started now to Chuck Robbins and whoever it's going to be after him, have been consistent in terms of empathy, not just customer focused, but actually caring for the people who are in the organization. And there's always bad apples in any company that big, but I'd say there's been a lot of good apples that I've had the chance to work with. And that's a reflection that comes down from the top. So that was one big thing, is finding leadership that was giving rhetoric that aligned with my values and how I wanted to live my life. And knowing that there was a good work-life balance opportunity, and they're very open to working remotely. Because when I was at Network to Code, I moved from San Jose, California to Reno, Nevada. And as a small company, they don't care about that change. At a big company, making those types of changes takes years and lots of paperwork. But when I left Cisco, now when I come back as a new employee, it's not a change. It's just, I'm a new employee. I happen to be in Nevada. So that's one other benefit, is like I left and came back, and it's like suddenly now I can say, if you want to hire me, I'm in Nevada. That's where I'm at. And I also had more of a salary acceleration that happened outside of Cisco, because you're not waiting for these annual performance reviews and this, spreadsheet of incremental raises and stuff. Where you're at a smaller company, you can have a lot more changes in that. So I think my expectations coming back to Cisco was that I was going to get paid a lot better. I was going to have a lot more seniority because I had outside industry experience where I was able to see other companies and how they operated. Apart from just being a different company, like because we're a consulting company, I got to see the IT operations of a lot of different types of companies that otherwise I'd only heard about in theory. So coming back, that gave me a lot more relevance in my skills. Coming back to Cisco, that decision was, I knew we wanted to start a family. I knew I wanted to work remotely, and I wanted to be doing something that was going to be at a more strategic, fun level, focusing on the skills that I enjoyed. So like I left Cisco from an operations role where I was doing teaching to Network to Code, where I was not in operations, but doing teaching and doing some consulting. And then leaving Network to Code, I was like, I love the teaching part, but I don't love being in the classroom for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and traveling all the time. That wasn't working well for me. And you can do that at Cisco. There's definitely instructor opportunities at Cisco. That's not what I was looking for. I was like, I want to be doing teaching. I saw someone like Hank Preston at the time who had been doing DevRel, developer relations, for network engineers, basically teaching them how to get started in automation, kind of similar to what I've been doing, but in that official capacity as a DevRel role. That seems so cool. It seems like you get to teach, but you don't have to like be in a classroom, and you don't have to be traveling all the time. You can just be doing the teaching part and influencing people without having to commit to all the other baggage that made it stressful for me. Finding what worked, what I enjoyed about my job, and then honing in on the parts that sparked the most joy, that gave me the most satisfaction, that decreased my stress the most. So kind of like each job I got, I got a little bit closer to doing what I really love doing. My first job, analyst, okay, I love being at Cisco and I love making things more efficient, but I want to be a little more technical. Okay, I'm a network engineer, but I don't like being on call, so let's do teaching. Okay, now that I'm teaching, part of DevRel is also the community building and the content creation and things that I was already doing on the side. And so it's like, oh, I didn't know this could be like a cool job. But just like being out on social media and seeing what different people's jobs were. I was like, that seems really cool. Let me see what skills it would take for me to do that. And so I saw the job opportunity come back at Cisco while I was in Network to Code. I wasn't really looking, but I always kind of keep an eye out. And so I saw a job posting for the NSOBU for NSO Developer Advocate. And when I looked at the job description, I was like, man, it was almost written for me. It was like the first time I'd ever seen a job requirement that I was completely confident in. I had a friend still in the NSOBU at the time, Victor, who I pinged on the side. Even though I wasn't at Cisco, I still had his contact info. I was like, hey, should I apply for this? And he's like, oh yeah, you should definitely apply for this. And so that gave me some validation. Like, okay, so I'll apply for that. And pretty shortly thereafter, I had the tough conversation with Network to Code, let them know I was going. And I came back to Cisco, this time in Reno, Nevada. And I came back to Cisco several pay grades higher than I'd left. And then since that job, I've gotten promoted again, coming to my new role here and the learning certification. So I'd say one thing, whenever I move, I always try to make sure I'm making more money. And sometimes that requires some pushback. When I end up leaving the NSO team and coming into my current role, it was for the next pay grade higher. And I went through the interview process and they came back to me and said, yeah, we'd like to have you. Since you had just gotten a promotion, you can't get a promotion with this job. And I was like, okay, well then I'm happy where I'm at. A week and a half later, they're like, oh, we were able to find an exception, and actually make it happen. This is just the HR process and kind of how those big company things work. So I would just say, if you're confident in your skills, you want to make them sweat a little bit too, and be like, I know what I'm worth, and I'm willing. That's one of the benefits of being in a position where you're happy, and you're like, okay, well, I don't need to move. Like, if you don't really value my skills for what it's worth, then we'll see what happens.
Yeah, you have to be willing to walk away, right? The answer may be no. When you were describing the constant iteration of what the most interesting aspect of your work is, it reminded me of the same process or concept that you told that young lady about how to take something that's already done and extend it a little bit just outside of your reach. Because when you start a job, you have this picture of what you're most interested in, what's going to be most interesting in that job, but you have to figure out, how did that change once I get into the job? How long do you think it takes you to figure out if you've hit on the most interesting thing or if it needs to change? Do you have a mental reevaluation that goes off every so often?
I think it's more in hindsight. Like, it's not like I'm in the job and I necessarily realize everything about the nuance part of that. Is that telling that narrative that we were talking about earlier, where now that I've told this so many times, I understand, but in the moment, I wasn't necessarily searching out for these incremental changes. I was just looking to see what was out there, what was interesting. I think for DevRel specifically, I knew I wanted to get into that eventually once I saw that was an option. So I knew my end goal was DevRel. Not end goal, but at least that's where I wanted to be eventually, but I need to be technical enough to be able to get there. So part of that is having some pipe dream, oh man, I'm definitely not qualified to be in DevRel. I just started network engineering, but I can develop my teaching skills. I can develop my technical skills. I can build documentation. I can talk to people who are in the role and things like that, where I think it's not so much being in the role over a certain period of time gives you this super insight into all the skills you'll need necessarily, but more so having an understanding of generally what direction you want to take your career, what skills do you want to focus on. If there is a job role that I want to be an architect one day, or I want to be a vice president one day, what skills does it take for me to get there? And understanding it might take you 10, 15 years to accomplish that, and enjoying all those steps in the middle for what they are. One thing I would say is understanding that if you're doing the same exact job description for way too long, it might not be challenging you to do new skills. I think for me, that'd be over 10 years. If you're doing 7, 10 years, the same thing, you might want to be thinking about, well, maybe I should be thinking about some type of pivot or course correction in terms of my career, because I think it's hard to continually be growing if you're doing the same exact job for 7, 10 plus years. So that'd be my metric. For me personally, I've switched jobs every 3 years about, so I can't give any metrics beyond that. So I'd say it probably takes me 2 or 3 years to figure out my jam, my groove in terms of what works. It takes me about a year to feel like I have my bearings on an organization about who do I need to access for particular resources or action items. So I'd say the first year is just establishing my bearings, getting my compass set. And then my second year is pretty much how am I adding value to the organization? What are the areas where there's gaps that my unique skill set can be brought to bear? And then I'd say after that has been established, then it's okay, now we're starting to expand out to other directions. Not only how do I influence this team, but how can I bring in insights and value from outside this organization? So now that I've been in this role for learning certifications for almost 3 years, I went to Splunk conference a couple weeks ago, and I met a ton of people at Splunk. Cisco recently acquired Splunk, and it's a really cool company. And I met some great people there. And I'm this would be great for us to have more Splunk content on our learning certifications channel, even though merger acquisition, it takes time for all of the business paperwork to fall into place.
Certainly.
I feel confident enough in my role now to know what we need to get done, who to talk to, that I can be engaging with people outside our organization to plug them into the right spots to have their value adding new value into what we need to get done. So for example, there's a lady named Alex who great Splunk how-to videos on their YouTube channel. And I learned so much from going through her content. And I told her in person, you're doing great work, really appreciate it. And after the conference, we need to reconnect and make sure, like, how can we continue this momentum? And so a lot of that's just identifying where those special connections are happening as you're doing your job and making notes to yourself to follow up and executing on that follow up. So I make a calendar reminder for myself, a week or two out. I use my calendar so much for stuff like that. So I'd say that's one huge life hack that's helped me in being in corporate life, is using my Outlook calendar as both a time tracker and also an aspirational action item list, where just like I would schedule a meeting with somebody to solve a problem, I schedule a meeting with myself to accomplish something. So, okay, I want to meet with this person from Splunk, but it's not urgent. I'll just scroll over 3 weeks, pick an open slot and plop a meeting, give myself enough context to remember what I need to do. And then suddenly it's 3 weeks later, I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot I need to do that. And I have that 30 minutes to do it because I blocked out that time. And retroactively, sometimes if I'm not planning things out, like just at the end of the day, I'll create calendar blocks like, okay, from 1 to 2 p.m., that's when I edited my tutorial. 2 to 3 p.m., that's when I took a break. Or 11 to 12, that's when I recorded a video or I did emails. And so when I get to the end of the week, Cisco has like an internal productivity tool called TeamSpace where you record the highs and lows of your week, what you did. All I have to do is just go to my calendar, take a quick glance at my time blocks and be like, oh, okay, these are the things I did in a bullet pointed list.
Oh, that's super cool.
And especially farther down the line, like what did you do this quarter? What did you do this year? Suddenly now I can just scroll through my calendar week by week and jot down all the stuff that I did, ignoring the filler stuff that were just documenting things that didn't matter.
Yeah, I like that. And that's a form of documenting your work, and it helps you build that narrative that you were talking about, which we all need. As we come to sort of land the plane here on this conversation, Jason, you saw layoffs earlier in your career, and that kind of shaped this mentality of the way you make decisions. Can you share the thoughts behind that?
Sure. When I first joined Cisco, it was right after the big housing crash of 08, 09, and the ramifications of that. And there was a significant layoff right after I joined the team. And I saw middle-aged people with kids who are doing a good job, salt of the earth type of people get laid off, who had good skills. And it wasn't that they were doing a bad job, just somebody didn't like them for reasons that were petty or unreasonable. And so that gave me a rude awakening of like, oh, like I can be doing a good job, be a good person, and somebody's just having a bad day or has their own mental health issues and has it out for somebody. Because you would think as a college person going to a company, like if I do a good job, I'm always going to have a job. But I'd say that one aspect is that sometimes you have people who make decisions that are not rational or on priorities that you don't agree with. And I'd say the other aspect, sometimes you get whole divisions that are just laid off for business reasons, where it's like, we're not doing this product anymore, so everybody's gone. And you're just gone. You did a great job, but like you're just swept up in the layoff. And so that gave me an insight of being like, I don't want to be in a position where I'm getting impacted by a layoff and I'm scrambling and I'm depressed and my identity's in crisis or something. I always, like seeing that layoff made me think I always want to be one, technically relevant, so it's easier for me to get a job, that my skill set is specific enough that it's relevant to what the industry is looking for. So that's why I got my CCNA and started going down that path right after the layoffs. Is there was a correlation there. If I do an analyst forever, I'm just going to get complacent and get laid off. And so one, being technically relevant, and then I'd say two, like continuing to improve and challenge myself and always take on new challenges that are improving the business and being willing to make the change for teams or companies when that makes sense. I always kind of adopted the mantra of laying myself off every 3 years, more or less, to force myself to get another job, or at least be open to another job. And I'd say for positions that were a totally new domain or a point in my career where I was moving from like beginner to intermediate to advanced, those periods would be more than 3 years, like more like 5 years. But my advice to anybody who's in a large corporation is be building a plan for yourself, both financially with the savings, and then from a skills and career and relationship perspective, that you're not surprised if you get the boot and you're not scrambling on LinkedIn. I've had people, managers even, that I've worked with before who messaged me on LinkedIn who are desperate for a job. And I don't just have jobs laying around. Like, I'd love to give you a job, but during layoffs, oftentimes they also freeze, openings and stuff like that. So it's one of those things where it's oftentimes completely outside the control of the people you're working with, and like also maintaining the relationships with people that you've worked with over the years. So even though I've moved a number of times, like I still keep in touch with a number of people from each of those different positions I've worked in. And that also gives me an opportunity where if I need to get a job in a hurry, I'm not just coming to them only when I need a job. They realize that I care about them as a person. I'm invested in their future, and our relationship meant more than just that one job.
I love it. Keep the network connections hot. Lay yourself off every few years and kind of expect it to come. If you focus on the preparation, maybe that is a way for people who are seeing these layoffs in our industry happening right now and in the last several years, and I would imagine they'll probably continue over time. Maybe if we focus on the process of preparing for that situation, it'll take our minds and the anxiety off of thinking about being in that situation.
I'd say like changing the narrative from a negative of I might get laid off and lose my job, and that's frightening, to a positive of I might get laid off, so I should enjoy it while it lasts and do all I can to continue to grow myself in my career so that if that happens to me, I'm ready to go. I'm not just scrambling because I didn't know this could possibly happen. It's like, no, I'm learning new skills. I'm connecting with people. I'm adding value to the business. So if they, for one reason or another, push me out the door, I'm hot off the press and ready to rumble.
Ready to rumble. I really like that. Well, listen, Jason, I want to say a big thank you for taking the time to share your journey and some of the insights from the course of your career. If people want to follow up on this conversation, where can they find you? Sure.
Great conversation. I'm on LinkedIn, Jason Belk. I'm on Twitter at Reno Belk. If you search for me for any of those, the handle I've tried to be consistent online is Reno Belk. So if you search for Reno Belk, you'll probably find me. I also have a link tree on both my Twitter and my LinkedIn. So if you click on that link tree link, you'll see links to my Cisco free tutorials. You'll see links to my GitHub profile, to videos I've done on YouTube for learning certifications, as well as how to get access to free tutorials. Part of my job is creating this free content for people out there in the industry on relevant topics. Like I did one recently on ChatGPT for a network engineer. Like one example being, how do you convert a Python 2 script to a Python 3 script and then create documentation for it? When I was a network engineer, that happened all the time in the sense that we had old scripts laying around that needed to be updated. And AI can't do everything, but it can do something like that pretty good. And so I'd say definitely check out my links, check out the Cisco U tutorials, and happy to connect.
Love those free resources. Thanks again, Jason. We really appreciate it.
Thanks.
So that narrative that Jason talked about, the only thing I know to call it is a personal narrative. Sometimes we are given an assignment like that in school to write a personal narrative, share a story from our lives. And that's really what we're doing in interviews. Did you notice that Jason wrote his personal narrative down before he started sharing it verbally? And he shared it multiple times. And that really aligns well with this idea of iterating. Not only iterating on the written version, but also the verbal version. And we talked about writing being a way to clarify or crystallize our thoughts before we get them out. Just like you might write an outline for a podcast intro or outro before you start spouting it off. The writing process is a thinking process to get you to a more complete thought. In fact, Jason would do that when he built courses and presentations. So I think that we can start to form this narrative through communicating our accomplishments, the things we've achieved, the things we've done in written form and in verbal form. Did you hear what Jason had to say about determining whether you might be stressed or near burnout? He talked about looking at your text messages. Have you ever done that? Have you ever tried this? If anybody out there has actually done this and looked at it, I'd love to hear from you. Shoot me a tweet or a DM on LinkedIn. I'd love to hear about how it went and if your perception of what you were saying was actually what you were saying. Looking at your text messages, looking at your social media posts, I would say that if you go and look at those things and find that they really are kind of negative, or maybe you're always talking about how difficult work is or a specific situation is, maybe it's time to start journaling and doing something like morning pages. I know we've talked about that on the show, but doing some journaling that's just for you to get those thoughts out on paper as a stress relief mechanism, maybe that could be something that helps you have another outlet for relaying those kinds of messages, processing them through writing. And maybe you'll find out that it's time to make a change of something in your life because the stress is just too much and it doesn't fit within the amount of stress you want to have in your life, just like Jason was telling us. And then are we taking the time, even when things are hard, even when things are tough at work, to continue to build and maintain those relationships with people not only that we work with, but that we worked with in the past and others in our industry that we've met through various forms and functions. I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Jason, and we'll see you next time.
Farewell, listeners. Tune in next time as the journey continues. I'm John White at BJourneyman, for Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_, signing off.
Adios.